On election night last year, Tucker Carlson was doing a panel with Fox News as they were evaluating what had happened on that election night. If you watched it, you saw the people at Fox News were having a hard time dealing with the idea that President Obama had been reelected, and so they were trying to make sense of what happened. And Tucker Carlson said something very interesting that night. He said the majority of people in the United States have no idea that this election was about abortion. That most people in the United States have no idea that this election was won and fought and battled over on the issue of abortion. Now, here's what he means by that. If you lived in what was a red state, I live in the state of Georgia, you live in Alabama, we were red states, we were going to go to Romney, so they were not going to spend money campaigning here. If you were in a blue state, California, New York, they were going to go to Obama. There was not going to be any funds that were going to be diverted to that place to campaign for Obama. But if you were in a battleground state, if you were in Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, Iowa, Colorado, and especially Ohio, the election was a radically different thing than it was in other places. Phone calls, television spots, emails, door-to-door, grassroots campaigning, all of it centered on the issue of abortion. Cecile Richards, the president of Planned Parenthood, was actually going door-to-door in Ohio, telling people that the issue of abortion is front and center, and women's rights to choose will be lost if Romney gets elected president. The rest of the country had no idea that they had a presidential election that was centering on abortion going on because we were living in hard blue, hard red states where this wasn't happening. But in the battleground states, it was front and center. And that wasn't the only place it was front and center in the last election cycle. 2 Republican senators absolutely blew their campaigns by answering one question about abortion badly. Now, I am willing to concede, by the way, as somebody whose job it is to travel around the country and train people how to answer questions about abortion well, that both of these guys answered that question badly, and Todd Aiken, in his legitimate rape statement, was a colossal disaster. But their elections were absolutely derailed by misanswering one question on the issue of abortion. I want to share this with you because a Pew Research study just came out recently where more than 51% of the people in the United States said that abortion is no longer an important issue in our country. Presidential elections are decided on the abortion issue. Senate races are decided on the abortion issue. House races, national and local, are decided on the abortion issue. The Supreme Court justices, it was not until Robert Bork became nominated for the Supreme Court and people became afraid that Roe v. Wade might fall because there was going to be a shift in ideology on the court that this idea of attacking Supreme Court nominees even came into place. It even has the name Borking someone. When Clarence Thomas was nominated, those people that were going to defend a women's right to choose said, we're going to Bork him. We're going to destroy his character. We're going to go after him. Why? Because of abortion. There is no more important, impactful, and influential moral issue in our country today. Not just because of the influence it has, but because what's that question? And most people that I talk to, when I go out and have conversations with people, they feel unprepared to discuss that. Now that's a problem because most people that I talk to when I'm training are obviously people who already agree with me. I very rarely train pro-choice people. I most often train pro-lifers. And I go to these organizations and I talk to them and I say, how do you feel about it? And they're terrified that the subject's going to come up, or they get angry and their emotion takes over. And as Greg Cunningham for the Center for Bioethical Reform says, we start shouting our conclusions at each other and nobody's arguing and nobody's listening. Or people believe that it is just a religious conviction. It is your religious belief. And they feel like I can't go out and talk to people because when I go out and I share scriptures with them like Psalm 139 where David says, you knit me in my mother's womb. Or Jeremiah 1:5 where God says he formed Jeremiah in his mother's womb. Or we talk about Luke in chapter 1 when Elizabeth sees Mary and John jumps in the womb at the presence of him. I share these religious convictions that were made in the image of God and people just aren't listening. And I'm not equipped to convince them that my religious beliefs should dictate how they're allowed to behave. They feel stuck and overwhelmed, and they have conversations that don't feel good. And friendships, I know friendships that have been ruined over this kind of a conversation. But when you train people how to do it well, when you equip them to have this conversation, You have different results. He mentioned University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I was dropped in the middle of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. After I did a presentation to their pro-life group, they said, we want to see you in action. So we're going to set a table up. And at this table, we're going to have people come up to you voluntarily. And if they want to dialogue with you, you'll have a chance to dialogue. I said, great. I'll be able to do that. I'll sit at that table. I'll dialogue with people that are interested in that. So that day came when we went out there and they walked up to me and said, look, the table's not going to work. I said, what's going on? And they said, well, it's First Amendment Day here at the University of North Carolina. In honor of the First Amendment, they said you can't have a table and talk about this. I said, okay. So what are we going to do? They said, well, we've got an idea. We're just going to draw on a sign and write a message, and we're going to hang it over your head. And you're going to stand in the middle of the pit because they said you could be there because they can't stop you just from being there. I said, all right, well, just do it, and I'll go stand out there. And I was going to 4-hour block. Well, I went out there, and they hang this sign up over my head that says, come take on the pro-lifer. And thousands of students are walking around, and they start to gather. And the first wave of students are angry. And they're yelling and they're screaming at me. Who do you think you are? How dare you tell people what they can do? They're talking about bombing clinics and things of that nature. And so as the crowd builds and people get angry, I can tell you that I stood in the middle of them and using some of the techniques that we're going to talk about over here in the next few minutes, within minutes, they were listening and talking and we were having a conversation. A conversation that was so productive that after being out there for 4 hours, a young woman was waiting to talk to me. She was the head of the pro-choice group on campus. And she said, thank you so much for coming. This campus needs to be able to have this conversation. It is such an important moral issue. We have to be able to talk about it. We have to be able to talk about it in an impacting way, a winsome way, in a way that changes minds. And I can tell you, you can do that because I once was as vile and hostile a pro-choice atheist as you have ever met. There was a time when I was as angry and bitter about pro-lifers as anybody you have ever seen. And how did I go from being a pro-choice atheist to a vocational pro-life Christian? It was good arguments and, as equally important, good arguers. You have to have the right spirit as you get in these arguments, and to be able to do that, it takes preparation. Now, you're going to meet two different kinds of people and two different kinds of responses when you get out there. There will be a nasty response, and you have to be prepared for that nasty response. If you remember about this time last year, Susan G. Komen, who is a foundation who gives money for breast cancer research and gives money for breast cancer prevention. They raise money through those walks. When Karen Handel came on board with Susan G. Komen, she convinced them that it would probably be good for us to stop giving grants to Planned Parenthood for them to make recommendations for mammograms. And if you remember what happened after that, you saw the very definition of nasty. A private foundation was told that they were not allowed to stop giving grants to an organization that is 8 times larger than them. A private organization was attacked and vilified and run to the ground. And overnight, Susan G. Komen, who was a hero to the cancer community, was being cast as this shill, this money-making scheme, this group that never did anything, attacked and viciously, a character assault, because they said they would no longer give money to Planned Parenthood because Planned Parenthood is the #1 provider for abortions in the United States. And the message was very clear. You're not allowed to stop supporting them because of the abortion issue. I see nasty all the time. I get yelled at and pointed at and screamed at by people. Nasty is out there and you have to be prepared to meet it, because what nasty wants to do is tell you you're not allowed to talk. Eddie Vedder, who is the lead singer of a group called Pearl Jam, one time was talking, he said, people on death row, the treatment of animals, women's right to choose, so much in America is based on religious fundamentalist Christianity. Grow up. This is the modern world. And I hear that echoed over and over again when I talk to people who disagree with us on fundamental issues. That's not dialogue. That's not argument. That's an attempt to intimidate. And the way that we stand against intimidation, as Greg was pointing out, was to recognize that we have our facts straight, that our beliefs correspond to the way things are in this world, and we have a case that we can make. So we prepare ourselves for that nastiness, and we return gracious argument to demonstrate the difference between the two for all of those watching. Because you may not change the mind of the person yelling at you, but you'd be surprised who's listening in the crowd, who's watching to see how you do, who's judging you. I can tell you as a fact, as a former atheist, I was much more impressed with the Christian who kept his cool than I was with the Christian who seemed to be a little bit smarter than the person he was talking about, but argued in an ungracious and hostile way. The ability to withstand that is an admirable trait. Look at the people we admire in this world. Why do we admire Gandhi? Because he was angry and mad and threw fits and yelled at people? No, there seems to be kind of a universal admiration for people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. because they took and withstood hatred and answered it with love. And so we have to be prepared to answer nasty, but almost more dangerous is subtle. Subtle is when you're talking to somebody and you hear something like this. And we hear this all the time. Scott has a story to swing. I had the same story when I was going in church to church trying to find pastors to talk to about upcoming events. And I got onto this campus and I see this man working in the garden. And I go talk to him. I said, "Where's your pastor's office?" And he tells me where it is. He said, "What are you here to talk about?" And I said, "Well, I'm here for an organization, a pro-life organization. I'm going to invite him to an event." And he said, "Oh, pro-life. So you talk about abortion?" I said, "Yes, I do talk about abortion." He said, "Well, you want to know what I think?" Which, by the way, is what everybody says when I tell them I talk about abortion for a living. I said, "Yeah, absolutely, sure. Tell me what you think." And he said, "I think abortion is wrong, but I think it ought to be legal because I don't think it's right for me to tell other people what they can and can't do." Okay, well, I learned this technique from my boss, Scott. I absolutely stole it from him and ripped it off, and I use it liberally all the time. And you are free to do that now as well, and to look smart and not cite us when you do it. Instead of getting angry, instead of getting mad, instead of starting to point at him and to make my argument, I said, "Can I ask you a question?" He said, "Sure, go ahead." And I said, "Why do you think abortion is wrong? Why do you personally think abortion is wrong?" He said, "I think abortion is wrong, but because I think it's a human being. I think it takes life of an innocent human being. I think it's murder." I said, "Okay. Can I repeat back to you what you just said to me?" And he said, "Yeah, sure, go ahead." And I said, "Do you think that abortion is wrong because it unjustly kills human beings? You think it kills babies. You think it's murder. But you think it ought to be legal for other people to kill babies, for other people to murder." And we just let that sink in for a second as he sort of processed it and thought it over. And he said, "Yeah, that's not right, is it?" And I was like, "Yeah, I don't think so either." And then we went on to talk about other things that I don't think he believed about what he told me. And we'll get onto that as we move on in this. But you understand that what happens with the majority of people that you meet is they have already made up their minds. They've already presupposed in this argument, in this discussion, that the unborn are not human. They've already determined before they even start to think about abortion. And so before we even engage in the argument supporting the pro-life position, the first thing that we want to do is point out to them the mistakes that they're making in their thinking. People make all kinds of mistakes in the way they process things. Greg illustrated that in his first presentation. If you get good at spotting those mistakes, it's not always necessary for you to have to stake out a claim. I tell people, look at arguments like a game of Risk. If you can defend something first without having to take over land, but if you've ever played Risk and you take over another country, you know the first thing that you have to do is defend that new country. So before we go off and take over other countries, let's first defend the one that we have, and we do so by letting them explain themselves to us. Let them see the mistakes that they're making. And they almost always are assuming already from the outset that the unborn are not human beings. And we use a tool as we get into that we call trot out the toddler. I'm sorry, I got a little ahead of myself for. I want to center ourselves as far as tell you what we're going to do. We engage well, we argue well by focusing on one central issue. What is the unborn? We're going to focus on that question like a laser. And I can tell you a brief story to give you some demonstration as to why this is important. On December 25th, 1990, I was driving on a rainy day. It was kind of a dark Christmas. I was going over to my grandmother's house. I come from a child of divorce, and so I do breakfast with my mom, and I would do the afternoon with my father's family. On that day, I was driving down the road, and I inadvertently took an innocent life. There was nothing that I could have done. Nothing that I could have done to stop what happened. And even though I knew that, this haunted me. It stayed with me. The incident just replayed itself over and over in my mind for about an hour. And then I started opening presents, and I completely forgot about the event altogether and just moved on and had a wonderful day. Now, that story can go either way as far as how you evaluate my response to it. If you find out that the innocent life that I took was a squirrel that sort of suicidally jumped out in front of me and there was nothing that I could do to stop myself from hitting it, you might not think me some kind of moral monster that opening presents cleared that of my head. I have no idea how many ants I killed on the way over either, any spiders I might have run over, and those kind of lives, it would have been different evaluation as well. I'm not bothered by the fact that bugs are hitting my windshield on the way over there, and I don't even enter that in my calculus whatsoever. But if that had been a child, a human being that I had hit, and I told you, well, after an hour I was fine, you would think there was something terribly wrong with me, wouldn't you? How could you have gotten over that? That would have been awful. A terrible, horrible thing. Greg does a great demonstration of this where he talks about, Daddy, can I kill this? He said, imagine you're a sink and a child comes up behind you while you're washing dishes and they say, Daddy, can I kill this? Well, what do we need to find out before we answer that question? What is it? That's right. My 8-year-old daughter walks in and she says, Daddy, can I kill this? I need to determine what she's holding prior to that. If it's my 4-year-old daughter, the answer is absolutely not. And unfortunately, increasingly, we're having these sort of problems in our house and we're trying to figure out how to deal with it. What is it is the determining question. In the debate with Nadine Strawson of the ACLU, my boss, Scott Klusendorf, was invited on the campus by the Christian organizations and the pro-life organizations, and she gets up and she gives her opening statement. In her opening statement, she talks about a woman's right to choose and that there's a financial freedom is at risk here. A woman cannot make the same amount of money, cannot be free in the workforce in the same way as men can if they don't have abortion as an option. Women should not be slave to the reproductive system. The government should not be allowed to tell women what they're allowed to do with their bodies. All of these things were centered on the idea of women's freedom and women's choice. And my boss got up to the lectern after she finished her and he said, you know what? I agree with everything Nadine Strawson just said. And he said you could see the pro-life community and the audience just dying, having a heart attack as he said that. He said, I am radically pro-choice. I believe that women ought to be able to choose their jobs, choose their places of employment. I believe they ought to be able to choose their schools, their husbands, where they live. I believe that in any way and every way that men and women have the same options of choices, that women should have the freedom to make those choices. And everything that Nadine Strawson said is true, and I will go even further than that. I think that the government ought to pay for all of abortions like they do all of the medical procedures out there. And he said, just as that group's about to have a heart attack and he sees them seizing up and having aneurysms over what he's saying, he said, I agree with everything she says if. If what? If the unborn are not human in the same way that you and I are. If the unborn are not human in the same way that you and I are, if they don't have the same value, if they don't have the same rights, then I agree with everything she said. But if they do, well, some choices are not legitimate. I endorse the freedom of women to make all sorts of choices, but I can't endorse the women to have the freedom to choose to do something that is a grave moral evil. And whether or not it is a moral evil is dependent upon one question. What is the unborn? And so we focus like that on a laser when we start to talk about it. And that's where we get to trot out the toddler. We notice that people are going to assume the inhumanity of the unborn before they get into it. And I've had a talk with a pastor, and I'm sitting across the table from this pastor, and we're chatting about abortion. And of course, it's my job to convince people as well as to train them. And this pastor is asking me different questions, and this pastor of a church looks at me and says, Jay, but what do we do about all these poor children? What do we do about all these poor children in the world? How do we handle that without abortion? Now, inside, I'm having a radically different reaction than I'm having on the outside. Inside, I'm seizing up. I'm thinking, you're a pastor of a church? You honestly think abortion is an answer to poverty, that we should just kill human beings in order, but that's not going to be productive, right? If I look at a pastor, start pointing at him and say, you're a moral monster. What is your problem? Are we going to get anywhere in that conversation? No. You evil, evil man. Let me show you some nasty pictures. That's not going to work. So I looked at him and I said, okay, I understand your question. I understand your concern. Can I do something? Can we do a little thought experiment here? He said, yeah, sure. I said, look, I put my hand on my hip and I said, I got a toddler standing right next to me. It's a little 2-year-old little girl. She is the 5th of 5 children. There is no doubt that this little girl is a tremendous financial burden on her family. That having this child has forced her family to become a 2-income family, has taken away resources from the other kids, and has put them and made them stretch their means to an extreme limit. This family would be easier for them financially if this girl wasn't here. Would you say it's okay for me to kill this 2-year-old little girl in order to lift the financial burdens off of this family? Well, what do you think that pastor said? No, absolutely not. And I said, well, why? So because that little girl's a human being. I said, aha. So if the unborn are human beings in the same way this little girl is, then we're not going to kill the unborn for financial reasons either. So the question isn't finances. The question is, what is the unborn? And I have a whole list of things there that I experience when we're out there talking. Child abuse, unwanted kids, economic hardship. I mean, people tell me it's privacy. This is an issue of privacy. That's what the Supreme Court said when Roe v. Wade. They said this is an issue of privacy. It's a private issue for a woman. When we say, okay, it's privacy. My neighbor has a 2-year-old child. He beats her every day. Abuses her violently. Do you think we should allow him to do so because he's doing so in the privacy of his own home? That we should honor his privacy and leave that child to what's happening? Well, absolutely not. Why not? Because that child's a human being. Oh, so it's not a question of privacy. It's a question of what are the unborn? This works over and over and over again. I've not even made an argument yet. I'm starting to point out to them that they're making mistakes in how they approach it. They're not thinking straight. They've assumed the most important question before they've even gotten to reasoning through the issue of abortion. They've already decided that the unborn don't count in the same way that you and I do. And so before they've even begun to think about it, they're dismissing them as something that we can do things to that we can't do to other people. They have to argue for that point. They're not allowed to assume it. And once we demonstrate for them that they have assumed it, we're at a position now where we can start to have a discussion centered on that one question. What is the unborn? Now, I can tell you, when you're on a college campus and you've got a group of college kids in front of you and you talk to them about Trot Out the Toddler, you say, is there anybody who has something that they want to tell me about, anyone they want to question about, anything you want to test me about with Trot Out the Toddler? And every time, without fail, there's one issue that comes up. Can anybody guess what that is? Rape. In their very gracious way, they come at you with the hardest thing first. Now, let me caution you, because Trot Out the Toddler does work when you're talking about rape. But Steve Wagner, who also worked with Greg at Stand to Reason and now works for a group called Justice for All, said, I thought one of the greatest things ever when talking about the rape question, or at least I heard it from him. He said that the rape question is not designed to determine whether or not the unborn are human. It's designed to determine whether or not the pro-life advocate is. Okay? I was standing on the campus over and over again in college campuses. Let's go back to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I had been whipping them all over the place in all these different arguments, and so we finally came down to rape. And this young man looks at me, furious, angry, and he points his finger at me, and he said, I cannot believe that you think it's fair to make a woman have a baby after she's been raped. Who do you think you are? And I said, whoa. Fair went out the window when that woman was raped. There is nothing fair about what's going on in her life. And I have never once said that. And I didn't argue that. I recognize that rape is a great moral evil. I think that rapists ought to be punished to the full extent of the law. And if somebody raped my wife or my daughter, I can imagine how angry and furious and vengeful I would feel inside and how I would struggle with that. That woman and fair are no longer in the same sentence. But I have a 2-year-old child standing next to me. This 2-year-old child is daily a reminder to his mother of a painful past experience. Every day, at some point in the day, she looks at her child and she is overcome with feelings of profound depression and sadness, at least once a day, as she relives that painful past experience. Would it be okay to kill this child to relieve that woman of her pain, of that reminder? Because if it's not, then rape is not the justification for taking an innocent human life. We as a society have a responsibility to find a better way to deal with rape victims than we're doing. We've got to find a way to give them the support that they need. We've got to treat them in a humane way, but I am not convinced now, and nor will I ever be, that the humane way to treat a rape victim is to just give them a blank check to kill their unborn child as if that took care of the problem. They can't become unraped. And we can find a better way to deal with them. There is no doubt that that will place a greater emphasis on us and how we respond through the love of Christ to reach out to people who are victims of such a great evil. But we can't just concede that, okay, that's tough, so that human you can kill, because if they're humans like you and I, we don't do that to relieve people of the pain of a memory of a painful past event. And so We use Tried Out the Toddler to help them to see how they're processing and the mistakes that they're making. But now we're going to have to make our point. Now we're going to have to get on to making the pro-life argument. And we're going to use two things to make that argument. We're going to use science and philosophy. We're going to use science to identify the unborn as human beings. We're going to use philosophy to discuss their value. We are not going to quote Scripture because, as Jacques Barzun points out in From Dawn to Decadence, there was a time when the world was willing to use Scripture as a corrective when they saw it as authority. There was a time when you could correct somebody by opening the Bible and reading to them passages of Scripture, and they would hear you, and they would say, oh, okay, I must correct my behavior to get in line with what you've just read me. But in the United States, largely that time has passed. And if you're trying to convince people who no longer agree with you on central issues merely by pointing at Scripture, you are just going to marginalize yourself as a religious person. But guess what? The good thing is if the Bible and the truth of Jesus Christ is the truth, then all truth will reflect that. Science will reflect that. Philosophy will reflect that. And we don't have to be afraid of entering into those areas. We can jump into those areas with the full confidence that if God is the truth of the universe, then the universe itself will testify to that truth. And if I have 5 minutes to talk to somebody about abortion, I can't worry about whether I can convince them that the Bible is authoritative. And so what I need to do is talk to them in the language that they speak. And more, that is not Christian. That is science and philosophy. And so that's where we're going to go. We're going to identify the unborn using science as human life. And then philosophy, we're going to talk about what it makes to be a valuable human being. So let's talk about science for a second. I can remember being in the break room when I worked in the professional HVAC. I would sell HVAC stuff in big contract buildings like this, and we'd sit in the break room, and I would hear people talk about abortion. And I heard this more often than not. Nobody knows what it is. Since nobody knows for sure what it is, there's no way for us to know what it is. Then how can we possibly legislate it? We have no idea what it is. I don't know anybody on a college campus that argues the sophisticated pro-choice argument that begins it with the point that we don't know what it is. That is something you encounter on the street. That is something I encounter with people who are not arguing this at an academic level. But nobody at the sophisticated level is arguing that we don't really know what it is. Everybody knows what it is. Embryology textbooks testify to the fact that from the very moment that it comes into existence, it is a distinct, living, and whole human being. I want to quote from this book right here, and I got this book out there on our table. This is the book my boss, Scott Klusendorf, wrote, The Case for Life. And in this book, everything that I'm talking about and much, much more is in there. But I want to quote a couple of things. First, from T.W. Sadler's Langman's Embryology. The development of a human being begins with fertilization, a process by which the spermatozoon from the male and the oocyte from the female unite to give rise to a new organism, the zygote. It is a new life. From the moment that it comes into existence, no less than Alan Guttmacher, medical doctor and one of the founders of the former Planned Parenthood president. I mean, it says, this all seems so simple and evident that it's difficult to picture a time when it wasn't part of the common knowledge that life began at conception. There isn't anybody arguing that. The Supreme Court seems to have a hard time figuring out, but they're the only people. They keep saying over and over again, well, nobody knows what it is. We know exactly what it is. From the moment that it comes into existence, it is a distinct, living, and whole human being. It is distinct because it is not like any cell in its parent's body. There is nothing in its parent's body like it. It is not a part of their parent's body. It is not a constituent part. Let me tell you how obvious this point is. Other night, we're sitting around at my table at dinner, and my 10-year-old son suddenly turns and looks at my wife. And he says to her, hey, Mom, did you know that there's a cell in a woman's body called an egg? And that when the sperm from a man meets up with that cell, it makes a new life? My wife's eyes are huge, and her mouth's just gaping open, and she looks at him and says, yeah, I did actually know that. How did you know that? And he's like, oh, I found a textbook on the shelf, anatomy book, and it was talking about there. And then he says this, I thought it was great. Don't worry about it. It only happens once a month. And he's like, thanks for putting us at ease there, son. My 10-year-old child just pulled a book off the shelf, and what we just talked about is so plainly obvious that he was able to read it, comprehend it, and then recite it back to us at the most inappropriate time imaginable with his 8-year-old and 4-year-old sister saying, what's he talking about? And I was like, all right. Mom said, silence, and Daddy will be talking to you about all of that and more very soon. And I was like, all right. It is painfully obvious, easily obvious, And people don't really argue this point. Now, there are some more sophisticated arguments that people are going to offer you, and I'll go over a couple of them really quickly. Some people will say that twinning makes it impossible to say that a distinct life begins at the moment of conception, because sometimes people have the ability to twin within the first 14 days of their life. So it may be two distinct lives that we're looking at, and we don't know. So to say that a life begins at the moment of conception is just false. Well, Patrick Lee has a great way of answering that question. He said, if you lay a flatworm on the table and you cut it in half, do you know what happens? You get two flatworms. He said, now, does it make sense to say that there was no flatworm before you cut it in half and had two? Well, if that doesn't make sense, then it doesn't make sense to say that there was no human life prior to the twinning. We just don't fully understand what's going on with twinning, but it doesn't mean that what existed prior to that wasn't a human life. It simply means that some life has the capacity to twin in a way that we don't really fully understand right now. There's other ways. There's one called, there's other genetically human growths. And they'll say, well, not everything that looks human or has that genetic code is a human life. There's a thing called a full hydatidiform mole. It comes into existence at the same time. And during the first 14 days of life, it looks like a human being. And then it devolves into a growth that is very dangerous for a woman. So if we can't look at it and say that's distinct at that point, then there's no way to say that life begins at conception. Or Maureen Kondik has written a paper where she rebuts that by saying, look, if you play the song, the alphabet song, and Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, for the first four measures, they sound exactly alike. And then they diverge. But that doesn't mean that we don't know what song was being played from the beginning once we get to that point, or that there was no independent song being played. Oh, gotcha. It just means that we couldn't observe what song it was until that point that it broke off. I was writing about this, and I talked about when I was out in Jackson Hole, and I was learning how to look for life. And they said, when you're out there wildlife spotting, if you're a hunter, you know this, you don't look through your scope to try to find things. The guy said, what I want you to do is I want you to look for big rocks. Look through your field of vision, find a big rock, and then watch the big rocks long enough, and sooner or later one of them will move. He said, and the ones that move aren't rocks. I was like, all right. So then get your spotting scope and look at them. They were never rocks that turned into living things. They were living things that I had to wait to see what they were, for me to be able to observe them, to distinguish them from the other things around them. So just because a hydatidiform mole looks like an early life doesn't mean an early life ever turns into that. It was what it was from the beginning. It just may have taken us till the formation of the primitive streak to be able to see what it was, for it to tell us what it was through its natural development. And then finally, you have the burning research lab, where they say if you're in a lab and it catches on fire, and let's say you have 10 embryos over here and there's a young child over there, who are you going to save? Most people say the child. They say, aha, you don't think they're human either. Well, if this building caught on fire and there was all you over there and my children over here, and I had to make a choice to save one of them, I'm running for my children and headed for the door. Does that mean that you're not human beings because I choose to save my kids first? No. Now, it would be different, by the way, a morally different act if once I got my kids, I decided that the rest of you might pose some sort of threat to me and I turned around and started mowing you down with a machine gun. Then there would be some question as to how I evaluated you as valuable human beings. But just because we choose to save one life over another doesn't mean anything as far as the identification of that life. Ultimately, all it's doing is calling into question me. Just because we choose to save, and this also mistakes another mistake, triage. Triage is where we do the best good that we can with the situation that we've had. If you see this in hospitals, they have to evaluate the cases that are coming in. Just because a hospital evaluates somebody and says, I can help this and this must be done fast and makes a decision, doesn't mean the person that they're not helping isn't a valuable human being, or it doesn't mean they don't think it's a valuable human being. It just means that at that split second as they're trying to make decisions, they made that decision at that moment to save that person. They saved who they can. And saving is not the same as destroying. So in that sense, the burning research lab fails as well. Now, some people are going to resist this because they're going to say things like, they're going to see human beings in a sense like an artifact. They're going to look at us and say, well, we look a lot like an artifact, like you're building something, and it's not yet a human being that's valuable in the way that we need it to be. But that's mistaking valuable things as far as developing things versus constructed things. We don't get built. Cars are built. We develop. What we are is determined there at that very first moment that we come into existence, and the development process just exposes what's already there. My height, my relative loss of hair, all of these things were part of my genetic makeup from the moment I came into existence. You just found out that I was going to lose hair in my 30s because you get to see me now in my 40s. And my development exposed those things for you. So all of these things as far as science and by the clump of cells versus organisms, we talk about the idea of a corpse and a body dies, there's still living human cells in it, but that doesn't mean that there's no longer an organized system that is serving the whole. The whole has ceased to exist. The parts may continue to run a little bit after death, but that is still the difference. We said distinct, living, and whole. Now, I want to show a video clip here for a second. I want to warn everybody before I show the clip that you are under no obligation to watch it, that there is no audio commentary to it. I will tell you when it's safe to look back if you don't want to watch it. And I'm going to talk about why we're going to show it in a moment. But one thing I want to be very clear about. If you are a woman or if you are a man who has experience with abortion, I do not show this clip in any way to judge you or to pass judgment on you. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I think is the greatest shame about the nature of this discussion is that we're scared to talk about it because we're afraid of offending people. And it's my experience as I go out and speak, there are men and women all over this country that are suffering from pain that God never intended them to carry because they won't come forward because they have heard the message loud and clear. Do not talk about abortion. And so they sit in the pews every Sunday and receive the message that the grace of God is not sufficient for them to come forward and to accept forgiveness for the pain of their past life or some action that they've taken. And they struggle and fight with a burden that God never intended for them to carry. So if you are out there and if you are in pain or you have in some way struggled with a past accident, this is no way meant to be a judgment on you. As a matter of fact, I encourage you to seek the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ, to no longer fear judgment for your past, to come forward because His grace is sufficient for all things. And you carry a pain that He never intended for you to carry. Now, I'm going to start this. We got it all set up. Right now, if you don't wish to watch it, I tell you to look away, and I will tell you when it is safe to look again. People ask us sometimes why we show images, and it's okay to look now if you did turn away. In 1955, a young man named Emmett went to visit family from his home in Chicago in Mississippi. Emmett was bragging to some of his friends in Mississippi that in Chicago things were different. In fact, he had a white girlfriend in Chicago, and they didn't believe him, and they were making fun of him and said, okay, well, if you're so brave, if you're so tough, let's see you go talk to a white woman here. While they were at a store, there's some question as whether he winked at her or whether he said hey to her, or he did talk to the woman who was working the counter at the store. As he was walking out, one of the men, the older man that was sitting out there, an older black man that saw him, said, "You have no idea what you've just done." 2 nights later, the parents or the husband of that woman that he talked to or winked at broke into his uncle's house, dragged Emmett Till out of his house, tortured the young man for hours, tied a prop to his neck, and threw him in the Tallahatchie River. When they got him out, put him in a casket and sent him home, they attached a note with it to Emmett Till's mother that says, "Do not open." Emmett Till's mother insisted on an open casket funeral. When people argued with her as to why she would do something like that, she said, "I want them to see what they did to my boy." Jet magazine ran pictures of Emmett Till's body, and thousands upon mourners walked through to see him, the mess that had become. And it was that moment that people started to understand what the hatred of racism was. It was a distant, abstract thing. But when you saw that life destroyed that way, there was no way to deny that what it was something wrong. You don't do that to human beings. And it was Emmett Till and those pictures and that event that started the catalyst that made the big change in the United States. As a matter of fact, Rosa Parks said it was Emmett Till that she was thinking about on that bus when she was told to move to the back. The moment she decided that she was no longer going to go along with the way things were. The country will not begin to understand abortion until we cease to be afraid to look at it. And when we're talking about what we're allowed to do to people, I stand in front of people on college campuses all the time, and I want to determine whether or not the person I'm talking to understands morality. And I say, "Do you think it would be okay, objectively, for me to kill you? Would it be objectively right now for me to kill you without justification?" Almost every person I ever talk to, with the exception of a few philosophy students, will say, "Absolutely not. It wouldn't be okay for you to kill me." Okay, so here's the question. What is the moral difference between me now and the embryo that I once was? That means if you do that to me today, it is murder. But if you do what we just saw on those screens to them today, it's a choice. What makes the difference between me then and me now, that it was okay then, but would be considered a grave moral offense now. And those choices are going to break down into 4 differences. It's the size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. The SLED acronym. I was smaller then. Well, and by the way, if you want it, we have SLED cards out there on my table. So don't feel like you have to worry about catching up on all that. The size, I was smaller then. Well, my 4-year-old child is smaller than me. Doesn't mean she has less value than I have. Do we understand things like that instinctively? Do you remember when the terrorists broke into those Jewish settlers' homes and they killed the entire family except that daughter that was gone? And the last one that they killed was they stabbed to death the infant child? Did anybody think, well, the child was less valuable, but it sure was a shame that they killed those other people? Size has nothing to do with how valuable we are, not intrinsic value, not value that we have by virtue of being human beings. I can be extrinsically valuable for being large, like an offensive tackle for the Atlanta Falcons. Sam Baker is more worth to them than I am. Nobody's going to pay me to be an offensive tackle in the NFL because their quarterback would be killed within 2 seconds of putting me on the offensive line. Size makes him extrinsically valuable to the Falcons, but it does not make it a graver moral offense to kill him than it would be to kill me. Level of development. They'll say, well, there is some development lacking. Something that they must acquire in order for them to consider us valuable. But the problem is that the person who makes that and draws that line is arbitrarily picking some point in the development process because generally there's something they want to do to them exactly prior to that point. We can't pick arbitrary places on the line. Why is it necessary for them to be conscious? That's one of the things I hear over and over again on college campuses is consciousness. They're not conscious, so they're not valuable. Well, Peter Singer argues that that is the case as well because he's trying to include animals into the animal rights group right there. But one of the things that happens if you say consciousness, you know who else isn't conscious is newborns. Newborns lack the level of consciousness necessary. Would you think it's okay to kill newborns? Some philosophers are arguing that it's okay to kill newborns because they lack consciousness. But normal people, normal functioning moral people, seem to have what they call a cringe factor at that, an ick factor. We recognize that there's something wrong. Environment was where they are. An 8-inch trip down the birth canal takes them from being the kind of thing that we can cut up to pieces legally as a protected right, and to do it immediately after they come out is a violation of all the laws of this country. Every single one of them on a federal level. Environment doesn't make you more or less valuable. It's just geography. It's where you are. And degree of dependency. If we start killing people because they're dependent, well, we already know the end-of-life issues are coming up as well. And if you look at somebody who's medically dependent, who needs people to take care of them, and we determine their value based on their neediness, we're going to have issues not just with the unborn and being justified to kill them, but we're going to be justified in killing all sorts of other people And who decides who's needy enough that we're free to kill them? That's the philosophical argument that we're going to have to deal with. I apologize that I've run out of time here, but I want to respect the time of everybody else. But we use that argument when we go out there and we talk. I want you to remind you of the SLED acronym. There is nothing philosophically that they're going to bring up that's not going to be about a size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. From the very moment they come into existence, they are whole, distinct, living human beings. They're human beings that have value based on their nature of what they are. Human beings have value. We understand that we are valuable as human beings intrinsically. We're valuable because we're human beings. We're not valuable because of the things that we can do or the things that we offer society. Those don't make it valuable, and they don't make it a grave moral offense to kill us. It's what makes us equal. It's why we can look at things. And I was talking to a young atheist earlier this week who denied these common facts. And he was saying to me, Jay, I just don't believe there's such a thing as objective moral values. I don't believe there's such a thing as human nature. I don't believe any of that. And I said, do you think that what they did in Pol Pot's Cambodia was right? He said, well, I personally don't think it was right. Okay, do you think Stalin was right? Well, I personally don't think it's right. Do you think Nazi Germany was all right in what they did to the Jews? Well, I don't personally believe that was the case. Without being able to say that we are by nature valuable, we lose the ability to have universal human rights and to be able to look at the kind of things that we see going on all over the world and to be able to point it and to say that is wrong and something must be done. And I told that young man that any worldview that lacks the ability to call something evil is deficient because there is evil in this world. There are things that we ought not to do to one another. And one of the arguments that you're going to hear about abortion is that it will change the way that we do things. It will change the way that we operate. It will forever change. We have a system now, and abortion is part of it, and we cannot retrain women. Sandra Day O'Connor said we have a whole generation of women that have grown up with the right to get an abortion, and they understand that right is fundamental to the way that they live their life. When Eric Metaxas was writing in the book Amazing Grace about William Wilberforce, he said when that man came into the world, slavery was the way that the world was. And institutions and countries and nations were built on slavery. It was not only accepted, it was believed that the world couldn't operate without it. And by the time he died, the world had changed. It had begun to see that you don't do that to other human beings. And we have to train ourselves to go out and argue to people. And that's why it's important that they be able to see those pictures. Because this isn't an academic argument. This isn't an argument that says, hey, I think this and you think that. And one of us is right, but let's not worry too much about it and not having strong feelings about it. This is an argument that says that if those people are human beings in the same way that you and I are, then we are unjustly killing more than 1.2 million human beings every year in the United States alone. That's a grave moral evil. And if that fact in and of itself isn't going to get you, understand that when the world has that kind of an evil working through it, it affects us all on spiritual levels that we cannot possibly calculate. We become less sensitive. We become more callous. Not just to the life that we take, but to all life around us. It changes the way that we operate. And look at our world. Don't we see signs of that already? We need to learn to argue well, using science and philosophy and being gracious ambassadors. We need to do it because if they are human beings, like you and I, then they need us to be their voice. For the first time in all of history, the victim of the oppression can't speak for themselves. There is no Martin Luther King Jr. coming. There's no Frederick Douglass coming. There's no Susan B. Anthony coming. There is no unborn that can declare their personhood for us. We're going to have to do it for them. And we're going to have to learn to do it because they're worth it and their lives are worth it. Thank you very much for your time.